Hello, welcome to the American University of Beirut from the Deb Center in New York City. I'm Rami Khouri, Director of the Global Engagement Initiative at AUB, which we run out of New York and Beirut. And I'm delighted to host you today to attend this event, this panel discussion between three distinguished archaeologists and experts in cultural heritage issues. And this is one of a series of events that we've been holding and will continue to hold as we inaugurate the Global Engagement series of panel discussions as the precursor to what will follow in the coming year, which will be a series of courses that will be offered online for people all over the world on these topics. And the theme of our work is to engage with colleagues, faculty members, practitioners, scholars all over the world on themes that matter to people all over the world. We've dealt with climate change, feminist activism, and other issues. Today's topic is archaeological museums and cultural heritage, the meaning, the ownership, and the stewardship of these important facts and issues and materials. We have three very distinguished panelists. Dr. Nadine Panayot is the American University of Beirut Archaeological Museum curator, and she's an associate professor of practice at the Department of History and Archaeology. From Paris, we have Dr. Francois Villeneuve, professor of archaeology at the Université Pantheon, Sorbonne in Paris, and he's had 30 years of field experience in the Middle East. And from the United States, from New Mexico now, Dr. Joseph Greene, who recently retired after many years as the deputy director and curator of the Museum of the Ancient Near East of Harvard University. And he also, like Francois and Nadine, has worked for several decades in the Middle East in archaeological fieldwork and related cultural issues. They will be talking about the various dimensions of our topic of museums, basically starting with museums, and then what goes on in museums, what is their role, how do they define the presentations they make, how do they define ancient history and identity, how do people relate to each other across borders, what happens over time when colonial period museums are set up that took a lot of artifacts from colonized people, and after the colonization ended, do those artifacts belong to the colonized or the colonizers, and how do we deal with those kinds of sensitive issues, both within the Middle East and across borders to Europe and North America and everywhere else. So I will turn over now to Dr. Joe Greene, who will be the first of our presenters, and we will have him speaking, then Francois Villeneuve, and then Nadine Panayot. And after that, we will have an open discussion with questions from the audience. Thank you again, and goodbye from the Global Engagement Initiative and the New York City Deb Center of the American University of Beirut.
Thank you, Rami, for the introduction. Thank you to AUB for organizing this, and for Rami for being the impresario, and to my fellow panelists. I look forward to our joint discussion. So the preliminary discussion among ourselves hammered out an outline, a set of topics, and we then parceled them out among ourselves. And I've taken up 2 of the 5 that we began with: why archaeology matters, and the habitats, the environment in which we humans live, and how that natural environment affects the way we practice archaeology. Now, inevitably, in any sort of introduction like this, I have to talk about what is archaeology. Some of this may be absolutely simple to all of you, but let me begin by explaining that obviously the Greeks had a word for it: archaeos, old, logos, knowledge or knowledge of. So it's the knowledge of old things, but the knowledge of old things can come in many ways. I mean, archaeologists attend to the material remains of what is old, and they, from those material remains, derive some knowledge. But we have knowledge of old things that don't involve archaeology. We have memory. Memories that are personal, memories that are communal, memories that are national. And some of what we'll address today is how those memories shape the way we view the things that archaeology defines as old. So one of the questions is, well, how old? Well, most archaeological artifacts don't come with a date stamped on them. One notable exception are coins, which often have their own date. That's true even today. But there are other things that have dates that aren't actually stamped on them. Think about the memories you have of your childhood and your birthdays. Now, our birthdays are not an occasion in which we take out our document, our birth certificate, and say, ah, yes, that was my birthday. It's more of a shared family event. And yes, you may need to produce that certificate for certain bureaucratic activities, such as getting a passport. But most of the time, our birthdays are part of a shared memory. And those shared memories can, of course, be extended beyond the family, to the extended family, to the community, to the nation at large. And for those kinds of memories, it's often important to have written records. Archaeologists do deal with written records, but there's a tension between what the past, how the past is understood through things and how the past is understood through text. I'll come back to this issue shortly. Now, archaeologists among themselves discuss some of the more arcane aspects of their practice and craft. And there has been an ongoing discussion for much of the 20th century and into the 21st of what is archaeology. Now, the French archaeologist Paul Corbin took issue with what in the 1970s was called the new archaeology, the effort to make archaeology, quote, more scientific. That is, to rely more on quantification and precision than on sweeping narratives of what happened in the past. This was an era in which I came of age as an archaeologist, and I was aware of this debate. I must admit, at the outset, I was more persuaded by the scientific approach, but I have come around to a different view, articulated, remarkably enough, by French historian Fernand Braudel. Braudel's masterwork was a history book, the history of the Mediterranean in the 15th century, the age of Philip II. But he uses a metaphor for framing that history as a series of connections among what he viewed as the interactions of levels of history. Évidemment, the events that occur day to day, month to month, things that are written about by the historians, he thought were less important than what he called conjonctures. These were the slow changing events in society, economy, and even in environment that shaped the long-term trajectory of human history. And it's these conjonctures he thought were the most important aspects of the human past. Now, he devoted himself to archival research, which built up from a whole series of minor pieces of information into large, sweeping reconstructions of how these interactions shaped human life. Underneath it all, again, to return to the sea metaphor, is the seabed, the long enduring environmental structure in which human activities take place, both these fast changing événements and these slower changing conjonctures. The important thing about conjoncture is that it takes place, these changes take place over periods of time longer than a human lifespan, longer than a human memory, sometimes even longer than a collective memory of a community. And it's that level of human history that archaeology is very best equipped to understand and to define what is old and how that changed from the past. I think archaeologists have always understood this. They simply haven't framed it in quite this way. And I find this metaphor quite powerful for understanding what it is we do. And unfortunately, because of the tension, especially in that era of archaeology in which there are texts that tell us what people were doing and thinking at the time, there's often a confusion attempt to draw straight lines between what people wrote about in the past and what was actually happening. And I think this is most apparent in the way that humans have related to the environment, because environmental change, as we've come to understand, can take place over long periods of time, longer than a human lifespan. And it requires us to look back at the evidence of past human effects on the environment and how that environment has changed, sometimes insensibly to the individual, but cumulatively, quite sensibly to the larger community. Now, there has been a recent fashion talking about the past as a new geological age. Geologists had established long ago successive geological ages that ended in what they call the recent, the Holocene. But looking back, geologists, environmental scientists, and archaeologists as well have come up with a new term, the Anthropocene, that era of geological and environmental history that humans, anthropoi, have had a hand in shaping. We're well aware of this discussion now because of current global concern about the state of the environment and whether at some point we will have reached a tipping point from which we cannot recover, whether it's global warming or sea level rise or some combination of those things that make the past, the future on this planet untenable. But let me go back into a fairly classic anthropological, archaeological question of when was it that humans actually figured out how to domesticate plants and animals and produce their own food rather than having to rely on hunting and gathering. Now, this was an understanding developed throughout the 20th century, roughly between 10,000 and 4,500 BC, that in the late prehistoric, humans, men and women, began to grow food and raise animals and move away from hunting and gathering, which had been the typical way of human subsistence going back before the emergence of the genus Homo, before 100,000 BC, when you find ample archaeological evidence for that kind of activity by humans in the Stone Age. The Neolithic, the New Stone Age, as archaeologists sometimes dub it, was a period of great change. And it took place without anybody thinking about what the implications would be. As I say, there was no environmental impact statement was devised. It was simply a way, and as far as we can figure, because there were no written records to tell us what was going on in their minds, a way of living a bit easier, of insensibly engaging in a genetic modification of plants and animals that resulted in effectively the kind of lifestyle we know now, which we rely on food production rather than hunting and gathering. It didn't mean that we've stopped hunting and gathering. It's simply not part of our major source of our subsistence. But there are other examples that archaeologists can point to in which we've seen how the past has been shaped by humans. I'll go through a few, mainly drawn from the Near East, which is an area of my expertise and an area of which I'm most familiar. Aside from domestication of plants and animals, how the domestication shaped what it was that how people lived on the land can be seen in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is an irrigation society, depended on the irrigation of primarily cereals in order to support a very complex civilization from which writing and urbanism emerged. But because of the nature of the water running down the Tigris-Euphrates system, which is by nature impregnated with salts, the land has to be carefully managed. But if it's not carefully managed, if for whatever reason, social, political, economic, farmers collectively begin to press fallow land, which is typically left to desalinize over periods of time into production, there is a spurt of production that can support an expansion of society and economy, but only for a short amount of time. And then the salinization of the soil takes over, it's no longer productive, and there's a consequent collapse of the economy, perhaps society, and an emergence of social disruption. This is not written down by anyone because it took place over a longer period of time than any single lifetime. And it certainly wasn't something that the people sitting in the cities who were writing about what was going on understood. Had an effect nonetheless. That was regional. In another instance, perhaps a happier outcome, in the early Bronze Age, in roughly coincident with the Egyptian Old Kingdom 4th and 5th dynasties, there was an explosion of economic activity emanating from Egypt to Lebanon that was extracting from that agricultural landscape quantities of oil and wine that were being brought back to Egypt because it couldn't be produced there and socked away for the afterlife in huge quantities. It was an economic stimulus in what had been previously mainly a village-based society that brought about urbanism in Canaan in the early Bronze Age, the latter part of the 3rd millennium BC. This collapsed owing to a completely unrelated environmental event of a reduction of monsoons that fed the Nile River. We know this from the Egyptian records. We have no written records for early Bronze Age Lebanon. We have what remained of that efflorescence of agricultural production, masses and masses of terraces, some of which were reactivated in much later periods for growing olive trees and grapes. These effects can be read in the environment, not only in the agricultural environment, also in, as it were, the ancient industrial landscape. In the Jordan Valley, below the Dead Sea, is the Wadi Finan, long-standing source of copper for Egypt and for the Levant. Archaeologically, it was detected to be an industrial landscape going back as far as the end of the Neolithic, just at the beginning of the transition from the prehistoric to the historic. And the effects of production of copper, first at a small scale, then a much larger scale, is very apparent on the landscape. Slag heaps, small settlements, and a lack of any sort of infrastructure that indicated that this was anything other than a means of extraction. Think about any other contemporary extraction site, which is industrial as opposed to either urbanized or even settled. It was clearly connected to a larger system, but it had this impact on the environment, which persists until this day. This took place all in what for us is the Bronze Age. There are other impacts of later periods that we can detect. And as I said, I've given mostly connections, instances of Near Eastern origin. There's one I'll pick from the New World, and it's a fairly recent piece of research which actually controverted an assumption that human intervention on the landscape had any effect on the environment. There is, in the Middle Mississippi Valley, the site of the Cahokia Mounds, around 1000 AD. Of course, there's no connection with the Old World. These huge mounds were occupied for several hundred years and then abandoned. It had been assumed for a long time, based on some very incomplete archaeological evidence, that the locals had built too big, deforested too much land, and had, in effect, invited the invasion of the Mississippi River to flood and cancel a civilization. Recent work at the site really confirms that this was not the case, that there are other reasons for the site's abandonment, nothing to do with environmental impacts. So it works both ways. We have this data, but we have no living witnesses. We often have no texts that talk about it because these events took place over periods longer than any human lifetime to notice and write about. So the final point I'll make about the effect of the interaction between humans and the environment in the past is that we're still interacting with the environment using tools and powers that weren't available to our ancient ancestors. The thing is that the changes we can make on the environment are much more radical, much more wide-ranging. And we don't know now whether archaeologists of the future will be able to look back into the 21st century and say, here's where they went wrong. We may not have the ability to, we don't know what their conclusions are. So for us now, I think not only is it important that we consider our impact on the environment as we now do it, but also because that impact not only affects the way that we live now, it has an impact on the way that we understand the past, because once the environment is damaged, sometimes erased by modern development, it destroys the laboratory in which archaeologists work. Now, briefly, I'll just mention museums, because these museums are in effect the distilled essence of what archaeology finds. They are a place that we go to understand the past, and my colleagues will engage more fully with this, but these museums are the distilled essence of archaeology, and there are places which, as I say, help us all understand the past better. Now, I've mentioned a few sites and authors. Here's a very short list of readings. If you really want to go back and look at these, you can just screen capture this particular slide and read these things at your leisure. And that is it for me.
Thank you, Joe. We will now move to Francois Villeneuve in Paris.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much to Rami for the invitation to this evening or morning session. I will try to deal with two of the topics of tonight or today, which are archaeology, national memories, and national myths on the one hand, and human age and interpret cultural heritage on the basis of a few case studies. I'm not a museum person, but a professor of archaeology and a field archaeologist. As such, I am interested in museums for students and for research, and museums are as reflection, more or less, or not, of archaeological inquiries. I live near the French Musée d'Archéologie Nationale in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, near Paris. It has a perfect location for such a museum, national archaeology, inside the National Castle, with a very instructive evolution. First step, the building, which is a medieval castle, was built from the 11th till the 16th century as a royal castle. Even it was the main royal castle in the mid-17th century. It was a royal castle till the French Revolution and even till the mid-19th century. At that time, the ideology of the French elite is that the French gentry is Frankish in origin. Second step, around 860, The Second Empire, the so-called Second Empire in the French history, Napoleon III, fascinated by archaeology himself, author of books on archaeology and Roman history, transforms the castle into a real museum. At that time, this is the end of the Frankish myth and of the interest to the Middle Ages. French people now are Romans. French people now are Romans because French power is in some way Roman. This is empire, and it practices imperialism. Hence, replica of Trajan's column in Rome in the moat of the museum. Hence also Napoleon's himself fascination for Julius Caesar's victory over the Gauls in the Battle of Alesia. Third step, 1870 till 1940. After this, French Empire was defeated by Prussians. French people now are Gauls. Hence, the major importance in the museum of Iron Age II rooms, which means late first millennium BC. Celtic weapons and jewels, fictive statue of Gaul chief Vercingetorix, etc. In the meantime, however, when and where useful, French people continue to be Romans. French imperialism in North Africa is Roman. And here we have the fascinating example of today's Churchill Mosque, an earlier French church, colonial church, built in the late 19th century, which is a fake Roman temple built with true Roman stones from the ruins, from the real Roman heritage of Algeria. Fourth step and last one, finally, this model of French people being Gauls was not fascinating nor convincing anymore, and Musée d'Archéologie Nationale, Museum of National Archaeology, swifted gradually in the last decades of the 20th century and early decades of our 21st century into what I would call an objective or neutral museum, with much insistence and much interest of the public on neutral periods, period with no names, no stories, like Paleolithics, Neolithics as well, Bronze Age still, or some periods earlier considered as barbarian or under-civilized, like some epochs or periods of the Middle Ages. Fortunately enough, since the beginnings of the 1860s, excellent collections were created already and developed there in that museum for every period since the lower Paleolithics, early Paleolithics, which paved the way for this tendentially neutral presentation. This is still called national archaeology, but nation here seems to have more or less the sense of territory, national territory, the construction step by step of what is France now or today. This is extremely narrow-minded, definitely, but fortunately enough, since the beginning of the museum too, there are collections and rooms for what was called compared archaeology everywhere in the world. Hence, the nice presence in this Musée d'Archéologie Nationale of prehistoric Palestine, for example, proto-historic Iran, Ugarit or Apamea in the Levant, etc. So national archaeology, also in the sense of what French archaeologists did abroad, did here and there in the world. Finally, this situation in favor both among decision makers and among the public is the disappearance of national myths as constitutive of that museum, among others, and the preference for a complete, objective presentation of what was discovered by archaeology since the beginning of humanity. Interestingly, that way, this very official and political public French museum with an 150 years story now, became close now in philosophy to spontaneous, small, private archaeology museums. I show very shortly two examples of that kind, private, spontaneous, and small museums in today's Saudi Arabia. The one at Jubba, the only settlement, an oasis, in the middle of the Nufud Desert. Mathaf Naif, the Naif Museum, is a fantastic bric-a-brac where you can find everything ancient that was collected in that oasis and around it. From prehistoric flints to North Arabian shepherds inscriptions of Roman period, more or less, and the 20th century weapons or postcards, including, of course, a nice collection of daily life and the Alid Shabi. The second one of these small spontaneous private museums in Kharasan, the islands in the southern Red Sea, Saudi islands. Again, the charming bric-a-brac, cross-shaped Christian funerary stels, portraits of every period, testimonies of pearl fishing of the 20th century, architectural stones from antiquity, from Hellenistic Egypt, more or less, South Arabian, Latin, and Arabic inscriptions, etc., etc. It is clear that the owners and founders of these museums, local learned persons, namely here in Kharasan, Ibrahim Miftah, decide that every parcel of local heritage is worth interest and constitutive of the regional history, without much consideration to theoretical, national, and religious history. For the national aspect, it is right the opposite of the somehow 20 Saudi regional archaeological public museums, which are more or less all the same, in order to underline the unity of the Saudi nation. For the religious aspect, right the opposite of the marvelous National Museum in Riyadh, entirely organized on the basis of a total dichotomy, separation of the pre-Islamic and Islamic periods, which are linked only by a kind of tunnel with a very nice light, symbolizing the revelation. So we do not get the same results at all. Spontaneous local museums reflect what many field archaeologists would say or would do. I mean, every remain is interesting and constitutive of a material story or history. While curators of official museums work closely with political and religious decision makers. This is the picture for Saudi Arabia. Let us finish with an example in Jordan, where the interactions between various stakeholders, including archaeologists, are more complex and more fluid. As a modern country, which is relatively composite, Jordan may need, if not a national myth, at least ancient references centered in its territory, its current territory, and that could be considered Arab. The Nabatean kingdom is convenient for that, since it is centered in Petra, on Petra, and it corresponds partly to modern Jordan in large part, and it was probably Arabic speaking. Thus, the most spectacular or the main focus of the modern Jordan Museum, Matraf al-Urdun in Amman, opened in the early 21st century. The main focus is on the Nabatean period, not only Petra itself, but other sites, including Darir, Kharbet al-Darir, a place where I did excavations with Jordanian colleagues. And here, of course, arrives the question of the meaning in depth of the components of heritage. Many of the Nabatean remains, architecture, artifacts, inscriptions date to the Roman period, which comes just after. Nabatean period is 1st century BC, AD, Roman period, 2nd century and 3rd century AD, roughly. This is a series of exact or extremely accurate 3D restitution of this Darir temple, of which some elements of decoration are nicely exhibited in Jordan Museum. So we can say, yes, this vestige, this remains like this temple especially, are Roman in date, but culturally Nabatean. So there are evidence for long-term Nabatean Arab background of today's Jordan. But actually, for the archaeologists, the picture is more complicated. The temple, for example, is not purely Nabatean and not purely Roman. It is a very sophisticated and very interesting, of course, mix. So I would conclude that the message from the European archaeologists would be, let us accept all kinds of ancient remains inside the heritage and inside museums in order to get inclusive, better than selective stories. And let us accept to consider many of them not as pure, but as the results of cultural transfers or mixings. Thank you.
All right. So basically, heritage is a complex mechanism in which many pasts conspire for recognition. It's very important, in my opinion at least, to tackle archaeology through its own history. Indeed, the history of archaeology gives an insight on human behavior that has shaped our view of the environment and our position within it. Several facts need to be considered. Okay. Basically, archaeology as a science has a relatively short lifespan. Archaeology is a Western discipline that was only introduced to Middle Eastern countries, for example, under European rule. Third, archaeology's development in Europe during the 19th century has been concurrent to the rise of nationalism. Its evolution is necessarily intertwined with historical narratives. Hence, the foundations of modern Europe, according to conceptual constructs, lie in the Eastern Mediterranean, making this area the cradle of civilization. Western historians have hence used the past to create the non-West, to forge a cultural lineage, and to carve out opposing identities. Generally speaking, it has never been a fair system for dialogue. Archaeology cannot refute its political position in educating us about our human history, dispelling long-held myths and biases, and influencing our present social structures. By its very nature, archaeology has always had a political component to it. Political realities have a strong and sometimes detrimental effect on both archaeological practice and interpretation. In other words, archaeological discoveries may become flags for newly formed ethnic groups or nations. Archaeological evidence has been misrepresented for nationalistic or democratic reasons, and the human past has been purposefully reconstructed. Ancient migrations can be justified by mythical and historical facts, which can be used to justify ethnic cleansing or modern territorial expansion. It has certainly been a source of contention, as seen in Palestine and Israel, Cyprus, for example, as well as Siberia, Croatia, Rwanda, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the Kurdistan. Archaeology's impact on the creation and legitimization of cultural or ethnic identity is enormous. So is the impact of politics on the degradation, selling, and obliteration of archaeological pasts from their current cultural context. The repercussions of war, nationalistic fervor, inter-ethnic violence, and the illegal and widely denounced trade of antiquities all contribute to such racial cleansing. Cultural degradation is a human response that leads to the creation of new policies, shaping new ethnic cultures, the deconstruction of specific classes, and the dissolution of the past. Let us consider the Middle East/Near East, or what was defined as the eternal Eastern question by Karl Marx. To this day, the region does not have a clear definition. The region's borders shift as the essence and scale of the Middle Eastern question changes. Let us observe what is happening in Iraq, Syria, and maybe soon Lebanon. Other than a historical nostalgic memory created by the word itself, there has been no secular organizing principle to make the Middle East a significant place. Although this is precisely a region where archaeology's materiality and practice are inexorably intertwined to the socio-political conditions that their respective societies are confronted with. In this region, archaeology matters in a very tangible as well as ideological ways. Imperialism and colonialism's relics are now present in many disputes, as well as our own academic constructs. In the specific case of Lebanon, for instance, there has been not one common founding myth to help establish a sense of identity. Could archaeological heritage been used to that effect? Most probably. Though there have been attempts to use the Phoenician lineage as a founding myth, but they have all failed royally. At the end of the day, these are man-made lands and men do in fact write their own history. Concluding my contribution to this panel, I would like to consider archaeology as a review of the past that enables us stepping into the future. It's a foundation for knowledge and conceptual understanding, in which intricate parameters such as field research and analysis, ethnicities, nationalisms, and identities all collide. The Council of Europe Framework Convention on the Value of Cultural Heritage for Society, signed in Faro back in 2005, asserts the need to involve everyone in society in the ongoing process of defining and managing cultural heritage. According to the Faro Convention, everyone has the right to benefit from the cultural heritage and to contribute towards its enrichment. Hence, rather than focusing on roots, future archaeological issues might focus on how concepts and identities are attributed and negotiated. A global archaeology that is conscious, committed, and invested may be a relevant, constructive force that recognizes and embraces distinction, diversity, hence becoming authentically polyphonic. So I will move now to museums, to the fifth and last panel of our discussion today. Museums as of knowledge and identity generate confidence and serenity. Indeed, our world is becoming more fragile and is subject to growing inequalities and tensions that are exacerbated by a variety of issues ranging from health to social, economic, political, environmental, and technological. The recent pandemic has confronted us with our human condition. There is a terrible gap between the past, a present which is uncertain, and a future with no clear vision. Yet, these intertwined conflicts serve as a reminder of how interconnected everything in our world has become. So our ability to adapt to our survival as a species, our ability to adapt is critical to our survival as a species. Humans, like many other animals, must adapt to the temperatures and environments, as well as an ever-increasing population. Archaeology can teach us what we've done in earlier times and what worked and what did not work. It's a tool to think about our past while still documenting it. This overall awareness will assist us in moving forward and improving these relationships. As a result, archaeology is almost entirely concerned with the future, allowing us to study the artifacts which can bear witness to important lessons from our ancestors: perfect adaptation to their environment, intelligent use of local resources, living in harmony with and respectful of nature. It is these modest and discrete human manifestations that give rise to the ingenuity of populations, granting our traditional life of yesterday meaning and power, and leading the way towards innovative ideas. In this ongoing mayhem, museums can play a healing role, but how? Our knowledge of other cultures plays a vital and often underestimated role in our ability to communicate within our own diverse communities and within the global community at large. Communication across cultures is about much more than speaking their language. It's about understanding all aspects of an individual, how they communicate, why they behave the way they do, why do they behave differently than we do, and how they perceive the world around them. Museums can provide the knowledge we need to recognize and understand our cultural differences. With that knowledge, we can interpret behaviors, overcome language barriers, and communicate far more effectively with respect and sensitivity, achieving the personal connections that are keys to a cohesive society. While we have the technology today to communicate to a more diverse global audience than ever before in history, we lack the cultural knowledge to make the most of those communications. Cultural exhibits open our eyes, our minds, and our hearts to the lives of others and the history, values, and customs that shape their behavior. The objects collected and displayed in museums enable us to experience a culture firsthand, providing a more meaningful, personal, and lasting impression. When we discover our similarities with other cultures, we experience stronger, more personal connections. When we explore and understand our differences, we achieve greater tolerance and acceptance. Museums then help us to view the world from the perspective of others and the challenges they've been through, fostering empathy and understanding. They give us a better sense of our world as a whole versus just our small part of it. By showcasing the historical achievements, contributions, and strengths of other cultures, museums increase our respect and appreciation of other groups. They help dispel harmful cultural stereotypes and reduce prejudice, discrimination, and racism. Hence, museums can help build social cohesion. I believe recognition and reverence are due to museums today. First and foremost, for the extraordinary effort put forward by their staff in fostering excellence in creativity and museum practice, as well as for their work within a larger context of dedication to citizenship, equality, and human rights, to bridging cultures, social and political boundaries, as well as long-term sustainability. Museums have undergone their own revolution with the onset of the 21st century, shifting from purely scientific and research-geared institutions to platforms of communication and exchange. Let's have a quick look at some of the museum's achievements in the past 20 years and during the pandemic. One major challenge was the recognition of the digital sphere as a distinct branch of curatorial practices. The digital realm opened up new horizons, endless possibilities, diverse partnerships, interdisciplinary projects, all one fingertip away. Museums have also played a major role in absorbing and redirecting anti-colonial manifestations that we have witnessed amid the pandemic, such as the pulling down of statues worldwide, and have redirected the anger towards constructive and healing dialogue. Museums have also addressed sustainability. Cultural influences are increasingly being recognized as important factors in long-term sustainability. Several parameters influence our quality of life, including health, jobs, education, cultural diversity, and environmental well-being. May I take this opportunity to remind us that natural and cultural heritage preservation are inherent to the 17 SDGs set by the United Nations for 2030. Achieving sustainability is critical to humans' well-being. So how did museums address these issues? First and foremost, through education and transmission, of course, Operation is second. Museums play another role as organization in their own right. They can serve as models of good practice in a wide range of activities, including the management of their resources, as well as their collections, which are an important global asset and a legacy for future generations. Most museums have also launched repatriation processes, despite, all the negotiations, let's say, and it has created a lot of polemic around the world, the question of repatriation. The Louvre, for example, has increased its provenance investigation activities for works collected during World War II that originated in former colonies. Provenance research is undoubtedly the main question museums have to deal with in the coming years to maintain their credibility, says the Musée du Louvre director, Jean-Luc Martinez. As well as in, for example, Germany. The seized Benin bronzes in Germany's public galleries are being returned in full. Indeed, the German government and 16 other states made a decision in 2019 to make arrangements for the restitution of artifacts in public collections that were removed, and I quote, in ways that are legally or morally unjustifiable today, end of quote, from former colonies, calling it an ethical and moral duty. Finally, museums have prioritized accessibility for disabled visitors, and hiring disabled persons has significantly changed how a museum evaluates and improves its inclusion activities. The world's museums are in need of recovery today after this grueling pandemic. They are also in need of redefining their raison d'être. Hence, this year's Icons poster, which is a clear message: the future of museums, recover and reimagine. I believe that this is a chance to take a leap of faith beyond hate, fear, and despair, and start a journey of commitment, perseverance, and repair, one step at a time. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine.
Sure.
Are we back on? I apologize for some technical issues we had, and I'm glad to be back with you. Well, that was quite an extraordinary overview of the last 10,000 years of human history, as well as the many different dimensions of the issues that we're discussing today, the convergence of culture and art and identity, nationalism, colonialism, public relations. I mean, it's just an extraordinarily rich field. This is a discussion that I've had with archaeologists and museum director friends and historians and contemporary political analysts all over the world as I've wandered between North America, Europe, and the Middle East. So we've got three experts with us today who really have a deep experience and knowledge, and I would add serious cultural sensitivity to other cultures. I mean, this is one of the reasons that we've chosen these three speakers, because they've proven through their work that they have their own personal views and identities, but they're also working very deeply to bring, as Nadine mentioned, to be open to other cultures, to understand other cultures. So we've got many different issues we can discuss. I'd like to open the discussion by asking you each to comment on the very sensitive but very important issue, increasingly important, of the post-colonial remnants or hangover. So when the colonial period existed in different parts of the world, there were many different colonial powers who colonized different people in many areas in the United States and South America and the Middle East, Asia, etc. And of course, in Europe, you had ancient colonial powers who occupied each other. But if we go back to the, say, 18th, 19th century, And there was the tremendous expansion in archaeological excavations, and artifacts were taken, and not just little artifacts, but entire structures. If you look at the Mshatta stone carvings from one of the Umayyad castles in Jordan on display and beautifully displayed in a museum, which is in Berlin. So the question becomes, well, where do these things belong? Who do they belong to? What's the best way to resolve some of these issues that come up? So maybe we'll go back to Nadine. Start with you. You've worked in different cultures. What's your sense about how we approach this issue?
Well, thank you, Rami. Basically, I would argue that this should be considered as a case-by-case study. Really, these questions should be taken very seriously. And what we have witnessed last year, as I showed with the debunking of some of these, statues, really put all museum curators at not at a disadvantage. On the contrary, it's an opportunity actually to open up, Pandora's box finally, and start looking in our own past and start looking. And when I'm saying that, it's because I consider that the AB Museum as well has a collection that belongs to different countries around the Near East. And that's why when I talk about it, I consider myself, even though I live in the Middle East and I curate a museum which is located in the Near East, still, we need to consider all questions of repatriation. It's not wrong to look into this, but we should go through this gradually, so to speak. So if you consider, for example, the bronzes of Benin or other artifacts that belong to ethnographic museums, and here I would like really to show the difference and the importance of the difference between ethnographic items and archaeological items. Usually ethnographic items are ceremonial items, and therefore they are living objects, and people from whom they were taken from still need them and need them to conduct their ceremonies and to live with them. So these come as a priority, as opposed to archaeological items that have been, for example, excavated or looted, literally looted in the 18th or 19th century. So you cannot really compare. And that's why I consider that one has to consider every issue gradually, and handle every case carefully and take decisions accordingly. That would be my contention.
Thank you. Francois, what's your perception of this from your vantage point of being in Paris, one of the great colonial centers with great museums, and also working throughout the South? You're muted, Francois. Put on your microphone.
Okay, this is for the microphone. I don't just an anecdote, by the way. Yesterday I was in the Louvre Museum. Okay, it can be considered as a normal experience, but at the moment it is not at all, because the Louvre is closed since maybe 1 year. And I was inside the Louvre and it was completely desert. So I was walking for kilometers. This is the Cyprus, one of the Cyprus rooms. And this is one of the Achaemenid rooms, Iranian. Okay, so I realized first that it is a palace and not only a museum, because it was completely empty. And second, that it's full of not only foreign things, but actually many, many, many things, objects, elements of architecture even that were taken or stolen or bought from many, many countries, which is an obvious. Okay, this is a real problem. On the other hand, we can admit that millions of people, like in British Museum, like in many great museums of the world, and now Abu Dhabi Louvre Museum, come from everywhere in the world in order to see and understand this beautifully treated and maintained elements, art objects, etc., and artifacts. Okay, but I am, as always, I'm thinking on this thing as a field archaeologist, and there I am mainly sensible to two things as a field archaeologist. First, the case, which happens very often actually, where a monument, for example, or elements of a unique site were dispersed, scattered in the world, in many places of the world, due to colonialism or post-colonialism, excavations, exchange, etc., etc. There are many, many examples. One place where I didn't work personally, but Joe is very familiar with that, is the place called in Jordan, Khirbet al-Tanur, very close to Khirbet al-Darir, which I showed in my short presentation. So architecture and sculpture, for example, of Khirbet al-Tanur are on display, small part still on the site itself, part in the Jordan Museum, part in the former Jordan Citadel Museum in Amman, part in Rockefeller, so-called Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, which was the Palestine National Museum before the Nakba, and part of it in the United States. So it's a pity, and it happened that two parts of a same stone, which is very important, which pictures a figure of Zodiac, were one of the part in the United States, the other one in Jordan, etc., etc. And this is especially, for me, it's especially sensitive. We cannot accept easily this kind of situation. This is one thing. The other thing is I make the comparison between spoliation of various countries in the world, for example, Middle East countries, which became source of approvisionment for the Louvre and British Museum and Halbinsel Museum in Berlin, etc., etc. Okay, but the situation is sometimes the same for the archaeological sites themselves, because we are used, even when we work in such a country like, let's say, Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, used to take away the most significant or the nicest elements, architecture, inscription, etc. Okay, when there are objects, artifacts, it's normal to put them in museum. But when it's architecture, this is still a kind of reflex. I remember the case where I was excavating in Hegra Medain Saleh in Saudi, in Hijaz recently. Well, I was excavating a gate in the rampart, okay, from the Nabatean and Roman period. And I was lucky enough to find a lot of inscriptions in the architecture of the gate. And the Saudi colleagues told me, well, we want to take them to put them in the museum. I told them, okay, you are the boss here, it's your country, but I feel that it's not a good idea. Why to dismantle the architecture and the site itself, which should also be open to visitors. And it has, the site has its own virtue as an element of cultural heritage. That's the two main elements for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Joe, your view of this, particularly maybe with a word about your experience now. You're living in New Mexico in the United States, and there are many indigenous issues there that are internal, and as well as the ones that Francois and Nadine mentioned, which are more international.
Thank you, Rami. Let me first make an observation about this problem that has been described of artifacts from ex-colonial countries accumulating in museums in metropolitan centers. And this is doubtless the case. And the whole question of repatriation, whether these things should be sent back to their countries of origin, is a politically fraught one. It's not something that archaeologists alone can answer. And if you consider the recently published Savoie report about the repatriation of ethnographic materials to sub-Saharan Africa, there is significant investment in public policy in that document that commits the government of France to repatriate those things. But this is, only one instance. But there's another aspect of this colonial, the colonization or the colonialism of archaeology abroad, and that is the notion that these things can be accumulated and put on display in museums in the ex-colonial countries, so that it becomes a model of how the metropolitan colonial power is behaving. It's good to have a collection, a local collection in a local museum that resembles in its organization and presentation what is done in the metropolitan center. Now, this seemed quite normal in the era of colonization, when colonial powers obviously replicated their entire social and urban and entire social and political system in those foreign countries. In the ex-colonial or the post-colonial era, say after the Second World War, these museums were part of the legacy of those colonial powers. And so you have the Palestine Archaeological Museum in East Jerusalem. You have the Jordan Archaeological Museum on the Citadel. You have what has become the Syrian National Museum in Damascus. You have the National Museum of Beirut. And these are legacies which were handed over and operated in many cases the same way they had been operated under the colonial regimes, with different personnel, but not necessarily different ideas about what one did to make a museum. Now, if I can refer specifically to Nadine's home turf, and she, of course, it's her museum, so she can correct my details, but my understanding is that the first university museum abroad, because it was created as part of what was then the Syrian Protestant College, and its collections are encyclopedic for the region. So it has busts from Palmyra. It has pottery from Cyprus, as well as local materials, all of which was accumulated by a museum regime operating in a, frankly, colonial manner. And it still has that material. And Nadine has already expressed the sort of conundrum she finds in saying, well, I have material in my collections that, if they were in Europe, might be subject to repatriation. What do I do? What does AUB do? I don't have an answer for you, Nadine. But the notion that these museums represent, in effect, the past of the colonial country that has now been, by default become part of the cultural heritage of the newly independent country, presents that country with a certain amount of its own decisions to make. How do we reinterpret this as part of our shared heritage? And let alone the sort of the practical problem is, well, what does one do with a 100-year-old building that is, it was a state-of-the-art museum for, the 1920s or the 1890s, and now it needs to be replaced. Well, certain countries have made other decisions. The Egyptians have created the Grand Egyptian Museum, which is going to replace the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square, which is quaint, but in effect, a museum of a museum. The Lebanese, in a strange twist of fate, had an opportunity to do this with the National Museum in Beirut, but only because the thing was ineffectively stripped and used as a strong point during the Civil War. And when it was created, it was recreated much the way it used to exist, with new casework and some new labels. The Jordanians had the same problem. The Citadel Museum was never adequate for a national museum. They made a new building. The Syrians were in the process of doing this before the Civil War broke out. So the situation is quite different in the Gulf, where there wasn't necessarily strong colonial imprint. And the new museums of the Gulf are taken lock, stock, and barrel, mainly turnkey operations directly from Europe. So there isn't this process of development, but that's a separate question. As for the American Southwest, well, the the federal law called the Native American Graves Repatriation Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, was imposed on US institutions that had collections of Native American materials. And the law said you must inventory and make an effort to repatriate to federally recognized tribes. It's a very complex legal and administrative or bureaucratic situation. It is still a work in progress. And there are still Native American collections in American museums, including at the Smithsonian, which is the American National Museum. And some of that material has been repatriated, some of it hasn't. Some of it is in legal limbo. In other cases, different tribes have taken different attitudes. Some say, yes, give it back and don't ask us about it again. Some say, let's co-curate this. Some have gone to the extent of creating their own, in effect, departments of antiquity so that they can curate and display their own materials in their own selected fashion. Some have worked collaboratively with existing institutions to enhance knowledge and understanding of these things. But the bottom line is that this happened because there was a federal law and everyone had to obey it. There isn't, as it were, a global NAGPRA, and even the conventions that UNESCO promulgates are only guidelines. They have no enforcement mechanism. So we're a long way from any sort of international cultural regime that has, in effect, teeth in it to create either the responsibility or the requirement that material be repatriated.
Thank you, Joe. We've got a couple of questions from Konstantinos. Yes?
Rami, excuse me. I wanted just to add something about this big question. I think before we go into repatriation cases specifically, I think it's very important already in every museum to change the discourse and the narrative. I think what people need more than anything else is recognition. I think that will be the first step worldwide. Then we delve into repatriation case by case, as I mentioned before. And as just Joe highlighted right now, I mean, it just depends on every case and every situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just add to that before we go to the questions from the audience? Is there a possibility in dealing with these situations to have co-management of an artifact? Let's say the Diban stele, the Misha stele in Paris, which is an extraordinary text from the Iron Age. It's from Jordan. It was taken to France, well preserved, beautifully displayed. Can we say this is actually owned by Jordan, but co-managed by the French and the Jordanian people, and possibly even occasionally, moving it, bringing it to Jordan for 5 years and then bringing it back? And this could happen all over the world, as well as the issue of perfect duplicates, which now technologically we can replicate, whether it's a painting on a vase or a whole sculptured stone monument or something. But this idea of co-management, acknowledging that it's owned by the country where it was excavated, even if there wasn't a country when it was excavated, is that something that's reasonable, Francois?
Extremely reasonable. There is also the case where the replica are ancient, because it may happen that a few copies or identical object or artifacts were produced, and in that case it becomes much more easy, much easier to have example of them in the country where they were discovered, and others for loan, for example, in other countries. Yesterday I was, as I said, in the Louvre, and I saw with pleasure one of these clay Neolithic Ain Razel statue from Jordan, and the curator who was with me told me that there was just a renewal for 35 years of the loan from Jordan Museum to our Department of Antiquities of Jordan to the Louvre. And this is the kind of good idea, of course.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have some questions from Konstantinos Politis, better known as Dino Politis, an archaeologist who has worked extensively across the region. He's asking several questions. I want to put the one he put to Francois. He says, I'm like you, a field archaeologist who felt obligated to use museums to display what we have found for the general public, including tourism. But have we compromised our academic research? Is there any compromise, Francois, in putting things out there for tourists, or are those complementary academic as well as touristic display?
This is, of course, a difficult question, extremely difficult. I don't know how Dino Politis himself feels the question and the answer, because he was in charge. He decided to help opening a museum at the lowest point in the world, and there are also many other examples of public regional or local museums in the Near East, like Qasr al-Halabat, etc. Compromise, of course, but as archaeologists, as field archaeologists, we can imagine and understand and perceive that for the public, the small specialized public and the broader public, some discoveries are extremely important, impressive or nice or monumental or etc., whatever it is. And we must admit probably that it's normal to insist on the presentation of these elements and not necessarily on the huge quantities of, let us say, a small potsherd that we would discover, which are certainly extremely interesting from the point of view of chronology or small people daily life, etc., etc. But if we don't think of a special presentation with the ideas of dealing with that special topic, daily life of the small people, of the poor people, etc., sometimes it's normal to insist on more obvious topics, more spectacular topics. Personally, I'm not shocked by this approach.
Question to Joe, also from Dino. It seems we have gone from using archaeology and museums for national identities in the 19th century to more scientific studies in the mid-20th century, and now back to identities, which seems precarious, question mark. That's going back and forth.
I think that there is not a unified approach that one can say it went from this to that, back to this. The whole notion that the past is represented by objects which are part of an identity, we'll leave aside for the moment whose identity, has always been latent in the collection of material and collection and display of material. I think that the quote scientific approach may have been more of a reaction to the tying too closely of an artifactual collection to events. Mm-hmm. As I say, I think the accumulation of archaeological materials speaks much more readily and usefully to Brodel's conjoncture. And to draw straight lines from an event, say mentioned in an inscription, mentioned in an ancient text, to a particular find, that's precarious. I think that the contemporary reemergence of a critical attitude toward how the past is represented in artifacts, which artifacts, how old, from where, represents sort of a realization that we can, in fact, make those interpretations, but we have to do so carefully. So I don't know that we've swung back and forth necessarily, but we have, I hope, enlarged our understanding of how we understand the past through artifacts, the collection of, and how they are arranged, but also how the past is remembered, both as written down in text and in shall we say, a shared cultural memory that not necessarily is not necessarily written down.
Thank you. And a question for Nadine, which I will kind of paraphrase and expand on myself. Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries, have very pluralistic populations, religiously, ethnically, nationally. So if you take a country like Lebanon, you have 18 different confessional groups. If you take a country like Jordan, you have trans-Jordanian, indigenous Jordanians. You have Palestinians who came over, became Jordanian, people from the Hijaz, people from southern Syria, Druze, Armenians. I mean, we've got these incredible combinations of people within modern countries with one passport, one nationality. How do you find the challenge of presenting a national museum in a country that has many subnational identities, and not just that identities are there, but these identities often in modern times are manifested in political ways, and sometimes antagonistic political ways?
Not sometimes, always, Rami.
Yeah, often, yeah. I was being polite.
But the thing is, that's what I mentioned in my presentations. What we are lacking in this part of the world is a common secular identification, a secular identity. That's the only way to overcome these diversities, not overcome them in a negative way. On the contrary, it's to basically overcome the differences to come in a real union of appropriating one's past through a secular identity, or what I called earlier a founding myth. We all need these founding myths. I mean, all the countries around the world are prefabricated. Remember, we had this discussion before when we were actually preparing for this discussion and this panel. Right. And definitely all countries are prefabricated. And as I said, men, at the end of the day, men write their own histories. But the thing is, you need a founding myth in order to live in specific boundaries and to identify yourself with some kind of a history, a discourse, a narrative. You need that. As a human species, we need that. We need to make, to give a meaning and a lineage. And that's why roots are important. And there is no future without past. And there is no future without roots and without our past. So I don't know if I did answer, but I mean, the one way is to actually overcome the diversities and use them as a richness, as a positive impact, not a negative one, but, you know, go beyond the communities and use something that is common to all. And that's where archaeology can really bond people together, because we all have the common past. We all have common archaeologies, common histories, whether we like it or not. These are facts.
Thank you, Nadine. On that note, we will have to bring this discussion to a close. And it reminds us again that the past has changed and the present continues to change. If you just look at the contemporary Arab world in the last 20, 30 years, countries have split up and joined and broken apart, and small groups within countries have developed their own power and sovereignty. So this is a never-ending process of national evolution, cultural evolution, the languages people speak. This has been a fascinating, I think, discussion to show the complexities and the many dimensions of museums as our starting point, but the issues that are manifested in museums and by museums are just incredibly important and complex. And perhaps museums can emerge as one of the arenas where these clashing or identities or configurations of people have some clashes among them or tensions. Maybe that's one way that can be reduced or resolved one day, inshallah, in our museums. So with that, I need to thank the three panelists, Joe Greene, Francois Villeneuve, and Nadine Panayot for being with us, and Dennis Villa and Alison Freeland for a lot of the work to make this happen at AUB. and to remind our audience that this is a initiative of the AUB Global Engagement Initiative at the Deb Center in New York City. And we will be doing more activities of this nature, leading on to courses in the future that people can sign up for, online courses. And we will also put a full transcript and a full tape recording and an edited transcript, a short précis transcript of this panel within probably a week or so. It'll be online at the Global Engagement Initiative website. Just go to AUB New York City and you'll find it.